They say you should never meet your heroes. But what happens when you finally do, and the person standing in front of you isn't even real? For Dave Chappelle, meeting Jim Carrey wasn't just disappointing, it was unsettling. Not because Carrey was rude, not because he was distant, but because, in that moment, Jim Carrey simply didn't exist. And what Chappelle experienced that day would quietly reshape how people saw one of the most beloved comedians in the world. Because behind the rubber face, the wild energy, and the laughter, there was always something else. Something harder to explain. Something people didn't fully understand until now. If you ask anyone to name one of the most iconic comedic actors of all time, the answer almost always comes quickly: Jim Carrey. Not just because he was funny, but because of how he was funny. He didn't just deliver jokes. He became them. His face twisted into impossible shapes. His body moved like it didn't follow normal rules. Every performance felt like it was happening on the edge of chaos, completely unpredictable, yet somehow perfectly controlled. It wasn't just comedy. It was transformation. But even at the peak of his success, when the world saw someone electrifying, there were already whispers of something else beneath the surface. Because the version of Jim Carrey the audience loved wasn't always the version people met in real life. And to understand that difference, you have to go back, long before Hollywood, long before the fame, to a version of Jim Carrey that looked nothing like the man the world would come to know. Jim Carrey wasn't born into fame. He wasn't even born into stability. James Eugene Carrey entered the world in Newmarket, Ontario, into a working-class family that lived a quiet, ordinary life, at least on the surface. His father, Percy, was a talented musician who had put his dreams aside for a stable job in accounting. His mother, Kathleen, stayed at home managing the household. Together, they created a life that seemed steady until it wasn't. Because slowly, almost quietly, things began to fall apart. Money grew tight. Stability slipped away. And before long, the life they had built began to collapse under the weight of reality. At one point, it got so bad that the entire family lost their home. They didn't just struggle. They became homeless. Living out of a Volkswagen van, Jim and his family drifted through one of the most uncertain periods of their lives. Nights weren't spent dreaming about the future. They were spent figuring out where they would sleep. Sometimes that meant a tent in a park near Lake Ontario. Other times it meant enduring long, exhausting nights working jobs just to survive. As a teenager, Jim wasn't chasing comedy clubs or auditions. He was working overnight shifts as a janitor and security guard in a factory, trying to help his family stay afloat. 8-hour nights, repetitive work, physical exhaustion, a life that looked nothing like the one he would eventually live. And yet, even in that environment, something inside him refused to disappear. Because long before the world ever saw him, Jim Carrey had already started becoming someone else. At just 8 years old, he would stand in front of a mirror for hours, stretching his face, experimenting with expressions, pushing himself to see how far he could go. It wasn't just play. It was discovery. By 10, he was so convinced of his talent that he wrote a letter to Carol Burnett asking for a spot on her show. And when a response came back, even a standard one, it was enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a dream. But belief alone doesn't change reality. And reality kept pulling him back. When Jim first stepped onto a comedy stage, it didn't go the way people might expect. There was no instant success, no standing ovation, just silence and then rejection. At 15 years old, he performed at a small comedy club in Toronto. He wore a bright polyester suit, chosen by his mother, a symbol of optimism that didn't match the room he was about to face. The audience wasn't there for light impressions or safe humor. They wanted something sharper, edgier, more experienced. And within minutes, it became painfully clear that he wasn't ready. The set fell apart. The jokes didn't land. And the feeling that followed wasn't just embarrassment, it was doubt. The kind of doubt that lingers. The kind that makes you question whether you belong at all. For a while, it seemed easier to step away, to accept a different life. But something about failure didn't push him out. It pulled him deeper. Because when he returned to the stage, he wasn't the same person. He was sharper, more focused, more determined. And slowly, things began to change. Small gigs turned into paid performances. Open mics turned into recognition. The same spaces that once rejected him started to notice him. And by the time he was 17, Jim Carrey wasn't just trying anymore. He was building something real. The 1980s became a turning point, not because everything suddenly worked, but because he refused to stop. He auditioned for major opportunities and got turned away. He opened for crowds that didn't want him there and got booed off stage. He chased moments that never fully materialized, but each setback didn't end the story. It reshaped it, because behind every rejection there was growth. And eventually, that persistence led to something bigger. A review in the Toronto Star praised his performance, calling attention to something special, something undeniable. From there, the momentum started building. He began performing across Canada, gaining recognition, expanding his reach. Then came television roles. Then came bigger stages. And finally, Hollywood. When Jim Carrey broke into mainstream success, he didn't just arrive, he exploded. Ace Ventura, The Mask, Dumb and Dumber. One after another, these films didn't just perform well, they defined an era. Suddenly, Jim Carrey wasn't just a comedian. He was a phenomenon. His energy was unmatched. His style was unmistakable. His presence dominated every scene he stepped into. But even as his career reached incredible heights, something else was quietly unfolding behind the scenes. Because fame doesn't simplify a person, it amplifies them. And for Jim Carrey, that meant everything. His intensity, his creativity, his unpredictability only grew stronger. His personal life began to reflect that same instability. Relationships started with passion, but often ended in confusion. His marriage to Melissa Womer, a relationship built before fame, came to an unexpected end just as his career was taking off. Soon after, he became involved with Lauren Holly, his co-star. What followed was a whirlwind romance that quickly turned into marriage and then just as quickly into divorce. Less than a year. That was all it took for something that seemed like a fresh start to collapse. And it didn't stop there. More relationships followed. Some deeply meaningful, some highly public, each one carrying the same pattern, connection, intensity, and eventually separation. There was something about Jim Carrey that made closeness complicated, not impossible, but unpredictable. And over time, that unpredictability became part of how people understood him. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of who Jim Carrey had become didn't show up in his relationships. It showed up in his work, because when he stepped into certain roles, he didn't just act. He disappeared. Nowhere was this more evident than during the filming of Man on the Moon, where he portrayed the legendary performer Andy Kaufman. From the outside, it looked like another bold performance. But behind the scenes, something much stranger was happening. Jim Carrey didn't play Andy Kaufman. He became him, completely. Not just when the cameras were rolling, but all the time. He spoke like him, moved like him, thought like him, and more importantly, he refused to stop, even when filming paused, even when people addressed him as Jim, because as far as he was concerned, Jim Carrey wasn't there anymore. Only Andy Kaufman remained. At first, it seemed like dedication. Then it started to feel like something else, because the line between performance and reality wasn't just blurred, it was gone. And this is where Dave Chappelle enters the story. At the time, Chappelle respected Jim Carrey, looked up to him, even so. When the opportunity came to meet him on set, it should have been a simple moment. An introduction, a conversation, maybe even a connection. But the moment Chappelle arrived, something felt off. Because the person he was introduced to wasn't Jim Carrey. It was Andy Kaufman. Fully, completely, no breaks. No acknowledgement of reality. And what made it even more unsettling wasn't just Carrey's behavior, it was everyone else. The crew played along. They addressed him as Andy, treated him as Andy, accepted the illusion as if it were real. So suddenly, Chappelle wasn't just meeting an actor. He was stepping into a reality where everyone had agreed to pretend, except him, because from his perspective, there was no confusion. He knew exactly who he was looking at, Jim Carrey, and yet Jim refused to exist. What followed wasn't a quick interaction. It was hours of conversation with someone who wouldn't break character, hours of pretending, hours of navigating a situation that didn't feel real. And beneath the humor Chappelle later used to describe it, there was something else: disappointment. Because he didn't meet Jim Carrey that day, he met a performance, and it never ended. That moment wasn't just awkward, it was revealing, because it showed something deeper about Jim Carrey, something that had always been there, but rarely seen so clearly. A willingness to go so far into a role that coming back wasn't guaranteed. Even Carrey himself would later admit how intense that experience was, how it felt less like acting and more like losing himself entirely. And when you look back at everything, his career, his relationships, his evolution, it starts to make sense. Because Jim Carrey was never just playing characters. He was searching for something: identity, meaning, escape. And sometimes in that search, the lines between who he was and who he played became impossible to separate. In later years, that search took different forms. He stepped away from the spotlight, turned to painting, explored deeper philosophical ideas about life, existence, and identity. To some, it felt like growth. To others, it felt like distance. But in many ways, it was consistent with everything that came before. Because Jim Carrey was never predictable. And maybe that was always the point. So, when people look back at that moment, Dave Chappelle meeting Jim Carrey, it's easy to see it as just a strange story. An odd encounter. A funny anecdote. But it's more than that. It's a glimpse into something real. A moment where admiration met reality, and reality didn't match expectations. Because sometimes, the people we admire most aren't exactly who we think they are. And sometimes, they're not even there at all. So, the question isn't just what happened that day. The question is, was Jim Carrey ever really just one person to begin with? Or was he always something more complicated than that? What do you think? Was it dedication or something deeper? And if you had the chance to meet your hero, would you still take it?